Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Todd's Inheritance. Glad you came for our celebration of Juneteenth. My name is Ross Kimmel. I am on the Board of Trustees here at Todd's. I used to work for the Maryland Park Service. This is Maryland Park Service property, part of North Point State Park. Glad to say I was instrumental in the state acquiring this. I'm now retired. But after retiring, I like the folks so much, and I like the site so much, I've stayed on it for 13 years as a volunteer. Today we're commemorating or celebrating Juneteenth, which is something maybe some of you, maybe a lot of you don't really know a lot about. It's a holiday that actually goes back to the end of the Civil War. And it marks word arriving to enslaved people around Galveston, Texas, when Galveston, which was the last Confederate stronghold, surrendered in early June of 1865, about a month and a half, almost 2 months, after Robert E. Lee had surrendered his army at Appomattox. The last Confederate army at the last Confederate stronghold surrendered. Now, of course, having been under Confederate control, the African American folks, or African Texans as we can call them, were still held in slavery, because the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a brilliant political document, didn't really practically free any slaves. It just declared free those slaves who were still in Confederate-held territory. It didn't apply to Southern territory that the Union had captured, and it didn't apply to the 4 border states: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Those states still had slavery and were allowed to continue. This business about changing the Union war aim from preservation of the Union to include liberation of the slaves was a very politically difficult thing for Abraham Lincoln to do, and this is how he handled it. In any case, word arrived in Galveston and in Texas among the enslaved people that the war was over and they were now free in about on June 19th, 1865. And it's been remembered, it was a process that occurred over several days. It's been remembered locally and in some communities as Juneteenth. I first heard about it, and I'm an historian, only about 10 or 15 years ago. But President Biden has declared it a national holiday. And the holiday is June 19th, but it'll be celebrated on June 18th because that's a Monday and y'all get a 3-day holiday. I wish they wouldn't do that. I think these days ought to be celebrated on the day they commemorate. The only one you can't do that with is 4th of July, because it's the 4th of July. It should really be called Independence Day. Anyway, Todd's Inheritance traces its history with European settlers back to about 1664, when the first Todd family, they were English folks who had migrated to Gloucester, Virginia, down near Yorktown. They came here to newly established Baltimore County in the colony of Maryland in the mid-1660s. And they must have brought about 20 people with them, probably some enslaved, but also free servants and family members. When you brought people into the colony, you were awarded 100 acres head rights for every single person. So if they got 1,000 acres, which is what they got, they must have brought 20 people with them. And we're pretty certain that a lot of them would have been enslaved. I was just handed this morning a handwritten copy of a testamentary inventory taken in 1717 when one of the Todds died, Thomas Todd. Whenever someone died, and they still do it today, I had to have my mother's personal possessions inventory. They go through your house and they write down every piece of chattel property that is not real property, including enslaved people, including white servants with terms of service left. And in this inventory taken here in 1717, they had one Negro man, Collie. He was worth 36, I'm not sure, it's probably pounds. One Negro woman, Judith, one Negro man, looks like Roger, one Negro man, Tarhee or something, can't make that out, one Negro man, Gilbert, one Negro man, Lord or Lamb, one Negro boy, about 8 years old, 10 pounds, one Negro girl, 3 years old, and there's a name but I can't make it out, one Negro named Jenny, 30 pounds, one Negro woman, Daphne, 28 pounds, one Negro man, Robin, 6 pounds, probably elderly and no longer capable of laboring, one Negro man, Pete, 30 pounds, and one white servant woman with 15 months left to serve, 21 pounds. And we also know from a document in the other room that as late as 1862, while the war was underway, there's a reference in a family ledger to certain people that they owed money to or owed them money with first names and last names. Then down at the bottom there's a reference to Moses with no first name or last name, probably an enslaved man. So slavery probably started here as early as 1664. That was the year Maryland passed. The colony of Maryland passed a slave law right down until 1864, which is when Maryland abolished slavery in its new constitution. And we got to find out what kind of impact that had on the Todds, because they lost a lot of labor, which would certainly cut back on their ability to survive as planters. Our speaker today is a native of Calvert County, Michael Kent. And if you don't know where Calvert County is, I brought a map. I tested someone here yesterday because they had no idea where it was. It's down here in southern Maryland, southern western shore, sandwiched between the Chesapeake and the Patuxent River. This part of Maryland is all in the coastal plain. Low-lying land, very fertile soil, long growing season, ideal for producing a single staple crop for which there was great worldwide demand, tobacco. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive, or was then, a very labor-intensive crop. Took a year-long cycle, which I won't bog you down with, and required a lot of affordable labor. White servants didn't supply the need, so when the Royal African Company was incorporated by Charles II, King of England, upon the Restoration, lots of African slaves poured into the Americas, not just the English Americas, but all over North and South America. And Calvert County was ideally suited to use gang labor to raise the crop of tobacco, and that's where Michael's family history comes in. Michael is a native of Calvert County. His family is native to Calvert County after they came from Africa, but he also has English ancestors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. So he published a book about the topic, and he called it Mulatto, The Black History of Calvert County, Maryland. And he'll explain why he used the term mulatto, I'm sure. He's a retired attorney who did his studies at the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland Law School in Baltimore. After leaving school, he joined the Naval Reserve as a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General, which is military talk for lawyer. After that, he joined the Baltimore City Prosecutor's Office. He's now retired, living back in Calvert County and devoting his time to researching not only his family, but the whole history of African Americans in Calvert County. He has served 2 terms on the Maryland Commission for African American History and Culture, and is currently on the Calvert County Historic District Preservation Commission, and he's the current president of the Calvert County branch of the NAACP. And he is adjutant of the American Legion Veterans Post 220. So, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Michael Kent to you, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his talk.
Thank you, Ross. Hello, everybody. I'm glad you have some idea now where Calvert County is. There are a lot of things that happen in that little small county that have affected things across the nation. People don't realize. The first governor of Maryland was born in Calvert County, Thomas Johnson. He has a bridge named after him now down there. But Thomas Johnson also was mainly responsible for George Washington being our first president. He advocated for George Washington during that election. Calvert County is also the birthplace of Roger Brooke Taney, who was responsible for possibly the worst Supreme Court decision ever. He was Supreme Court Justice, and he wrote the Dred Scott decision, which said that if you weren't named in the Constitution, you don't have any constitutional rights, which pretty much eliminated all people of color and females from having any rights. Also, we had another Supreme Court Justice visit Calvert County that had an effect on the world later on, and that was Thurgood Marshall. In 1939, one of our local teachers, Harriet Elizabeth Brown, found out that she was making $600 a year as a teacher, a lot of money, in 1939, but that her counterparts, white female teachers, were making $1,200 a year. So she was there alone, didn't have any family around. She reached out to the NAACP. They sent a young attorney there who was just out of law school named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall took her case, and that was his first Brown versus Board of Education, and he was able to get equal pay for teachers across the state of Maryland based on that first case. Those of you may have heard of a movie called Hidden Figures. There was a lady in there named Mary Winston Jackson. She graduated from Hampton University, and her first year teaching was in Calvert County in an all-black high school, well, actually junior high school. She was teaching math there. And she was Mary Winston then. She went on to NASA and to do all these wonderful things. The reason she left Calvert County is because Calvert County, again, this is 1940 that she was there, had a clause in the teacher's contract, female teacher's contract, that they were not allowed to marry. Their students were supposed to be their families. It was a big deal to get teachers there, especially teachers of color, to come to that county, and they wanted to make sure they could keep them. It was a strange thing because I grew up and I started off in a all-black segregated elementary school where all my teachers were Miss Brown, Miss Jones, Miss Gray, or whoever, not thinking anything of it because at that time teachers weren't as they were today, so I just thought everybody was not married because teachers were just naturally mean and nobody wanted to marry. I found out that was wrong, okay? There's some very nice teachers out there today. But we're here today to talk all the way back about 1812 and the War of 1812 and what was going on then. Now you see I'm not using any slides or projecting stuff like that because I received my history initially through oral histories. The other unique thing about Calvert County is that people, for whatever reason, live a long time. So my father was born in 1914. He lived 100 years. His mother lived 98 years. And other family members that lived 107 years. They were able to talk to people who had actually been enslaved. My father's grandfather was born in 1839, and so he spent a lot of time with his grandfather before his grandfather passed in almost 1940, and got a lot of history and the history of his mother and who his mother belonged to and all the way back from there. So my last name is Kent, and that name was taken from the Kent family, a white Kent family in Calvert County, who happened, we can trace ourselves back to 1780. Daniel and Ann Wheeler Kent were born and had a family in Lower Marlboro in Calvert County. Their one and only son, Joseph Kent, became the governor of Maryland in 1826. So his records were archived in Annapolis, which is how we were able to keep track of so many things that happened to our family, as opposed to losing records when the courthouses and churches and every other building you can imagine would burn down because everybody was using a wood stove during that time. So their oral histories, they passed on down the line, generation to generation, and a lot of it seemed kind of weird and out of place, didn't make much sense. and I wanted to track that. And so that's when I started doing research to see if what they were telling me was actually true. And surprisingly, I was able to find a lot of documentation to support what they were saying. And a lot of it centered around the War of 1812. And when the British came here in 1814, the first thing the British wanted to do was disrupt the economy. And as Ross was saying, the economy in southern Maryland was tobacco. So that meant destroying a lot of fields, destroying the barns, destroying anything, and the courthouse. They burned their courthouse in Prince Frederick when they came through. They did land at Benedict, and then they moved from Benedict into Prince Frederick, which was our town center at that time, and burned the courthouse. And then they came back to the river, and they started going up the Patuxent River, going from side to side, Calvert County, Charles County, a little bit of St. Mary's County, freeing enslaved people, burning crops, taking whatever food and supplies they could get. So my question was, you had the British coming here, saying you can have your freedom, and my family was there at Lower Marlborough, which is a little north of Benedict, when they came, and they said, no, we're not leaving. Now, my question is, why was my family so stupid? And then I came to find out, well, I'm being stupid. Once I found out the reason and the history, it made sense as to why they didn't leave. So what I researched and what I found out is why they stayed, but also what happened to the people that left. And there were different paths that people took when the British came through in 1814. First problem everybody had, again, was fear of these people that they didn't understand. Have you, any of you ever watched the British TV shows on, particularly the sitcoms that are on PBS? Who knows what they're saying? They're using different words for different things, especially if you have a Cockney accent. So now imagine 1814 and a British Cockney accent talking with a Southern black dialect. Does anybody know what anybody's saying? So what's in their mind is, and they've been there a couple of generations at this point, is that, hey, it did not work out that well for their family when they got on board ship with white people with a funny language. So why do it again? Again, they're thinking I'm going to be taken someplace and have to learn a whole new language, new crops, whatever I have to do. I'm used to what's going on here. So, okay, so why should I trust these people? And that was a lot of it, that they didn't trust them as to what they were going to be taken to and what would happen to them. Now, some said, hey, things are so bad here, I'm going to try it no matter what. So some people did leave with the British, and they ended up in Trinidad, Tobago, and Nova Scotia. And there's still some all-black settlements at each of those locations. Now, the ones in Trinidad you can track, because once they went there, they started calling themselves Americans, M-E-R-I-K-I-N-S. So these are the American settlements that are there. And a lot of those people have reached back to Calvert and other areas in southern Maryland looking for their relatives, their cousins who are still there. Nova Scotia still has black settlements there as well. And they made out pretty well there as well. Not as harsh as other places that they were taken to. So those people, for the most part, okay, although if I had a choice, and most people will say the same thing, I'd rather be in the United States right now than be in Trinidad. So looking at that standpoint, it worked out okay with them. There were also a group that decided, well, I'm going to join the British and fight with the British. They became known as colonial Marines. The British were always fighting everywhere all over the world, and they'd just left, I think it was Jamaica or someplace, where they had some other black soldiers, and they trained these soldiers, and they did fight with them, and they fought well. And you find that in the British newspapers at that time. As a matter of fact, that's one of the places I get a lot of these histories from, is although the American newspapers weren't saying anything about what was going on here, the British and Canadian newspapers were actually documenting what was going on here and what was going on with the black communities here in the United States. So the colonial Marines fought bravely. The war ended. The British were ordered out of the United States. Okay? The colonial Marines went with the British, but they didn't go back to England. They went down to Florida. The British were using Florida. There was a fort in Florida near Pensacola, Florida. It's called Fort Wilderness. And they were using that for their supplies. That's where they were stocking up the food, the ammunition, and everything that they'd be using farther north. And Florida at that time belonged to Spain. So America, wasn't the United States, couldn't do anything about it at that time because that belonged to Spain. So eventually, Andrew Jackson, who was not the president yet, but he was the head of the army, he still didn't want the British there. He said, get out altogether. And he petitioned Spain, which he had to go through Cuba to do that. That was the closest Spanish government. While he was awaiting an answer, this is what had happened. The British left that fort, Fort Wilderness, and they left it to the colonial Marines and to the Native Americans in that area, who were the Choctaw and the Seminoles. So more people started coming there after the British left. Runaway slaves said, hey, that's a shorter distance than Canada. They started going to this place in Florida. Other native tribes came there as well. So eventually that fort, which we never learned about in school, was called Negro Fort. And if you look it up, you can even look it up on Wikipedia now, Negro Fort, it'll tell you the history of that fort. And it lasted until about 1818, 1819. As I said, Andrew Jackson wasn't happy with it being there, so he sent some troops down, gunboats down, to warn them to get out, to tell them, and he didn't plan on any violence, it was just to warn them that I've sent messages to Spain to order you guys off this property. And there's a lot of misinformation about that being a haven for crime to happen, for blacks to leave there and do all types of mischief in Georgia and North Carolina, other places, and then run back to Negro Fort to hide, which didn't happen. They just wanted to settle and have some place where they could be in peace. So ultimately, when Jackson sent the gunboat there down the river to warn these people to leave, there were about 1,500 people there, 300 inside the fort. Now again, remember, this is where the British were stockpiling all their ammunition and food and everything. So when the captain of that gunship sent a shot over there just to warn them, it hit that ammunition. The entire fort blew up. Everybody inside, 300 people died. Okay. Everyone else scattered. They did catch a few, and then unfortunately the British turned them over to their allies, the Creek Indians, who did then torture and scalp some that were alive as a message not to ever do this again. So that's the shortest war in U.S. history which has never been documented. And also, it's the first time that enslaved people have been sought after on foreign soil, because again, this belonged to Spain at that time. That was the end of the colonial Marines. And we were talking about this upstairs, privateers that were also used during that time. Privateers were pretty much legalized pirates. Privateers could go and attack the British ships and take them and whatever stocks, stores they had into a neutral port, sell it, and then turn over the money, some of the money. They keep a lot of it, but some of it to the U.S. government. So some of those enslaved people that were freed by the British became privateers. The most famous one of the privateers was a man named Richard Crayfus, who was enslaved over on the eastern shore here in Maryland. Richard Crayfus is listed in all the records that they had there as being 7 feet tall. More than likely he was about 6'4", 6'5". Okay, but who were we talking with? We were taking the tour, and you said they had small feet. Most men at that time were about 5'4", 5'5". So a guy 6'4", 6'5" looks like he's 7 feet tall. Okay. But Richard Crayfus was an enslaved black man. He was captured as a privateer along with a number of other enslaved people that had become privateers, because you got to be your own boss. I know the ship, raid some other ships and take the money. They were captured and they were taken to Dartmoor prison back in England. For those of you old enough, which probably not that many of you remember Hogan's Heroes, it was kind of run like that, where they let you run the prison yourself. They just kept you in this location, gave you food, water, whatever, but you ran things yourself. Being this giant man, Richard Crayfus, he became in charge. And they had Europeans there as well, not just blacks, but French, Spanish, other because again, the British were at war with everybody. So other nations were there, and they had different buildings for the different people. But the British didn't get involved with what you did inside Dartmoor prison. So Richard Crayfus became in charge, put himself in charge, and carried a club around. And since he was in England, he became King Richard, and eventually King Dick is what he called himself. Okay. So King Dick was in charge at Dartmoor as to whatever happened, and the British had to negotiate with him if they wanted any people inside to do anything. So when the end of the war came, of course, part of the treaty said that all property had to be returned to its lawful owners, which would include the enslaved people that were at Dartmoor prison in England. But King Dick said, we're not going anywhere. And he still had his club. He said, you know, slavery is terrible. I'd rather stay here in prison than go back there. They had to negotiate with him, and they negotiated for 6 months in order to get him to leave and to bring the other enslaved people out. And so as a result, they did agree to come back to the United States, but only to the northern part, not to the south. Okay? And so that's where they were released. He's kind of lost in history as well. He's shortly after the War of 1812, he's found being some type of professional boxer someplace, and then we kind of lose track of him in history as to what else really happened to him, which happens a lot. For those of you who don't know, actually the first black legislator in Maryland came from St. Mary's County, Matthias D'Souza. Matthias D'Souza was a black man who was not enslaved, but he had come from, he was a mixture of Brazilian and black, and he served one term in the Maryland State Legislature. Because I don't think they realized that he was black, you know, because he was mixed. He was probably so light they didn't know. But somebody figured it out, and then after that one term, he disappeared. There is no record of what happened to him. Not that he died, not that he went off on a trip anywhere, and that was not seen. He just disappeared from history. No written documentation anywhere about what happened to this man who had served in the Maryland State Legislature. So, again, things can happen to you at that time. But eventually, as I said, King Dick came back, became a legend in England, but that was one thing that they had a choice to make, and they chose that, and I'd say that didn't work out too well either. So another choice, they'd already done the Colonial Marines, they'd also gone to Trinidad, gone to Nova Scotia. Another choice was to join the Americans, because, you know, you've got to be happy about that. If you join the Americans, they're going to give you your freedom, give you some rewards and things like that. Now, the reason, when I started researching, that I know about these things is there was a man named Charles Ball, who, again, I thought was the biggest idiot in the world until I read about him and read his story. Charles Ball was born in Calvert County, enslaved. At a very young age, he was taken from his mother. And his first memory in the book that he talks about is being pulled away from his mother and somebody hitting his mother, who was crying, to make her let him go. After he grew up with this new owner, we came to find, okay, this wasn't a bad person, because again, this was someone that was giving him food and clothing and everything. That new owner then ran into money problems and sold him south, sold him to, the first place is North Carolina, which wasn't that bad for him, but then again, that owner died, and he was then transferred to the owner's relative in Georgia, where they really mistreated him. So after 7 years of being down south, he was able to escape. And this is where I thought he was an idiot. He came back to Calvert County. For a time, you know, he was there for several years, and he joined the American Army. He joined the American Army thinking, okay, they're going to look out for me because I've joined them and helped them. And he became a hero, actually, in the War of 1812. During the Battle of Bladensburg in 1814, he fought with Joshua Barney and helped Joshua Barney win that battle, the Battle of Bladensburg. He wrote a book called Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave, and that's where this information comes from. It was like the longest title in the history. It's Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave, who escaped here, lived here, it's more than 50 words in the title. He wanted to get everything in so that if you didn't read the book, you at least know what he wanted to know. But Charles Ball, then, this is why I thought he was an idiot the second time. He was at the end of the War of 1812. He was enslaved again, and he was sent back down to Georgia, because again, there was no such thing as being free. Even if you were a free person, you have to have a papers on you saying why you're free, who freed you, and that you're allowed to go around. He didn't have that, so that's why he was enslaved again and sent back down. And at the end, it took him another year to escape again. He came back to Calvert County. That's why I thought, what an idiot. But then when you read the whole book, if you can get by the title and actually read the book, you understand. So if you were enslaved during that time in Calvert County, the life of a slave pretty much involved, he said, maybe 20 or more people living in one building on a dirt floor, not on pallets or anything. And you might get clothing once a year, you get the food that you need from your owner, and your treatment depended on what type of owner you had, what type of overseer you had. So you could have a decent life, you could have a miserable life, depending on who owned you. But you could also expect to work about 6 days a week, and then on the 7th day, which is Sunday, you could go visit family or friends if you had them nearby, or you could work. And using that work, you could use money to buy your freedom. Okay, so that's kind of an explanation of why he came back. When he was using that day off on Sunday, he was courting a lady that he eventually married and had children. So when he came back to Calvert County, it was to see his family, to be with his family. The first time back, they were still there, and he earned money in the War of 1812 to buy property near Baltimore. But again, he was an enslaved person that was on the run. So they didn't recognize his freedom. They sent him back to Georgia the second time. By the time he came back the next time after he escaped, his wife was gone, the kids were gone, he didn't know where anyone was. And that's the reason he kept going north at that time, and it eventually ended up in Canada. He wrote the book in Pittsburgh in the 1830s, but he eventually ended up in Canada. And Charles Ball, everybody recognizes, was not his real name because, again, he felt that was going to be a threat that they would then come after him again, because Taney's case, Dred Scott, was in the 1850s. So through that time, an enslaved person stayed an enslaved person for life, regardless of you leaving the South or leaving the country. If they could get you back, they would take you back. But that was his reason for coming back to Calvert County, and I found that that was my family's reason for not leaving Calvert County. Because in many cases, you would have family members taken from you, sold somewhere else, moved somewhere else, and their thinking was, they know where I am, I don't know where they are. So if I go somewhere else, if I leave, I run away, and they ultimately get their freedom, they're going to come back looking for me and not find me. So that was their reason for staying in Calvert County for all those generations. They also knew, aside from, as Charles Ball had said about being able to buy your freedom, that work in the tobacco field was miserable. Miserable work, and again, this is without modern equipment or anything. They were doing everything by hand. So by the time you were about 40 years old, you were so broken down that you really weren't of much use to that slave owner, and you'd often get your freedom just by reaching a certain age and them saying that it's more expensive to own this person, feed and clothe them, than it would be just to release them. That's one of the things that happened to my family. My great-great-grandmother, who belonged to the Kent family, when that family died off, she was sold at auction in 1836. That's actually when Governor Kent died in 1836. She was sold to the King family on King's Landing Road, which is where I still live today. King's Landing Road on the river, and that owner, James King, who had his wife and 4 kids, fathered 3 kids with her. And the oldest of which was my great-grandfather, Benjamin Kent. And she used the last name Kent rather than King because she didn't really want to fly in the face of James King's wife and their kids. So that's why she kept calling them Kent. And in 1850, well before the Civil War, James King gave her freedom, and he gave her 25 acres of land with a house on it. So she's like, why should I live in a house? I got free land. He's leaving me alone now because I'm an older woman. It was 1850. So that's why my family stayed, and eventually they started acquiring more property in the same area that she was in. Now, there were many reasons to run, not to want to stay there, because slavery was difficult. Well, not difficult, it was impossible for people to stay. One story is a man In the southern part of the county, he belonged to the Somerville family. His name was Brown. So again, it's no rights to anything. This was around the 1820s. Brown's owner was wounded. He was walking along and somebody shot him. Doesn't know who shot him. No one knows who shot him. It was just a shot coming out of nowhere. Got him. He decided this slave named Brown shot him because he didn't like the way Brown looked at him. Earlier, he had disciplined Brown's brother for coming home late from some event, and he felt that Brown had always retained a grudge against him for that reason. So he had Brown arrested. Obviously, he was convicted of white man's word against a slave. He wasn't killed, so they didn't kill Brown. They did, at the sheriff's office, whip him 100 times, 100 lashes. Then they let him heal up, and then they administered another 100 lashes. Then they shipped him up to Baltimore in order to be sent south, because again, you can't trust this man who wounded him. They were going to sell him south and just get whatever profit they could for him. Before they got him on the ship in Baltimore, a group of Quakers were able to steal him away and to get him up to Pennsylvania to safety. This comes back again to wanting to be with the family, because he had family in Calvert County, so he asked them to let his family know that he was safe in the state. He let the family know that he was safe, that the slave owner found out that he was safe in Pennsylvania, so a court case was filed, and that's how we know about this. Pennsylvania filed a lawsuit against Maryland to get this man back. Even though he already been punished a number of times, they said it still belongs to us and we want him back. Pennsylvania won the case. So Brown lost and was supposed to be brought back to Maryland. But again, the Quakers got to him first. And then they got him all the way to Canada to freedom. And ultimately, this is a surprising thing, this man who everybody thought was so worthless to just keep whipping him, became a doctor in Canada, in one of the black settlements up there, and helped a lot of people once he arrived up there. The other hardship that was impossible to ignore is that, like the weather we're having now, you never know when you're going to get rain, if ever. So tobacco is not a stable crop, and all it takes is one bad crop, and you are ruined, because you've got thousands of acres. This man I was telling you about, my great-great-grandfather, James King, he had 15,000 acres. So imagine one bad crop, and you can't afford the taxes on that, or pay for all the other maintenance and things that goes on there. So although there are some books out there calling tobacco the money crop was slaves. And as Ross was telling you about the border states didn't make money on cotton, and a lot of times they didn't make money on tobacco. They made money on slaves, on slave breeding. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of slaves shipped from Maryland, Kentucky, down to the south for the cotton. Okay? And I found out about that accidentally. I was reading this article. That was a former slave who had, this was in 1889, he was still alive, he was about 90-some years old. And they just started building a railroad over the beach in Calvert County. And someone from Washington, D.C., a newspaper man from Boston, came down to see this new railroad they were building. And so as he was walking along the beach, he came across this old black man and asked him where he could go to see the construction. So as this old black man was walking along with him, showing him the sights, he starts talking about how, as best his recollection is, that he fathered about 325 kids. And then he was talking, he said, my records were as good as the slave owners. I had like 325 kids. Never saw any of them after I had them, because he was just breeding them. He was expected to breed a certain number per year. And the women, who obviously were raped, they were expected to produce anywhere from 7 to 12 kids in their lifetime, okay, over those years. So when I checked that with the census records, you look at the census records from 1880, when they first started documenting the black people, there's a number of women, black females, that'll say they had 15, 18 children, but have no idea where they were, whether they were alive or dead or whatever. And that's the reason there was such bitterness from some people, again, and now I can understand why. It's something they could just never get over. But slave could bring you anywhere from $400 to $2,000. And so that supported a lot of the farms there, because again, you never could rely on the tobacco crop. You can always rely on getting the money from a slave. Now, from there, again, we're moving on past the War of 1814. The skills that were learned during the War of 1812 or 1814, the blacks that were aboard ship, the privateers, the colonial marines, those skills were then used between 1814 and 1865 for the end of the war. The majority of the merchant sailors, we'll find out, were black, former slaves, because that was the best, safest place you could be, is on ship. Okay? As I said, if you were on land, if you remember that movie 12 Years a Slave, even if you were free, somebody could grab you and say, hey, this is a slave, and sell them south. But you were aboard ship, and aboard ship was not only safe, but everybody, you lived together, and these ships are small, merchant ships. You lived together, you worked together, you played together, you ate together. Everybody got along aboard ship because they spent so much time together. And the reason there were so many blacks aboard ship, it was probably worse than being in the field with cotton and tobacco. So no white person, white male, young white male, would stay aboard. They may run away from home at 14, 15 years old and go aboard ship. After the first tour, they'd jump off and not want to come back. Now the black sailor was saying, hey, this is better than being whipped on shore, so I'll stay aboard. So they would stay for 10, 15 years, whereas the young white sailors would be off after one tour. So they gained seniority aboard ship, and that's what mattered to the captain, is the seniority. You knew what to do. So a lot of times the black sailors had seniority over the white sailors. And so there's stories, again, of a senior black sailor being able to whip a white sailor who had disobeyed some rule or law that they had. Then when they arrived in port and shore, he passed that same white sailor that he had whipped aboard ship and have to bow his head as he walked by him because of the customs aboard on land as opposed to at sea. And the only people at that time treated worse than the black slaves were white females. We got the vote for you and everything else. So a lot of white females would pretend to be men and get aboard these merchant ships as well. And everybody asks, well, how do you get away with that? You know, you're out at sea for a year or whatever, you're on the ship for years and years and nobody knows you're a female. This is what I find interesting about history, okay? Nobody ever took a bath. Water was bad for you, make you sick. And they were wearing the same clothes for a year at a time, okay? Also, certain biological things are going to happen at different times of the month. But here's where they went to the bathroom. Any of you that have been around the Navy or anything, the bathroom is called the head. That comes from being aboard ship. Again, if you put a bucket like you have upstairs, the chamber pots, into an enclosed room, it's going to smell. So they didn't want that below deck. They put it at the head of the ship, and that's why they called going to the bathroom going to the head. It would be a bucket at the head of the ship. Everybody's wearing the long jackets and things. And again, and I learned this firsthand too. If you're washing your car or something with that hose, out on the sea, that water's going to come back in your face. So everybody sat down when they were going to the bathroom, men or women, because you didn't want it coming back in your face. So everybody was sitting down. And as I said, certain times of the month, certain things are going to happen. And I think we talked about this upstairs. There were so many crossovers in what we talked about upstairs. The food on the ship was horrible. You had rotten meat, you had rotten potatoes, you had bad water. Everybody had stomach problems. So there's going to be blood in that stool if there's a woman aboard or not, because their stomach was so bad. So nobody ever knew. And you could stay aboard ship that way indefinitely, no one ever knowing, just because of the conditions. Now, we're here today because of Juneteenth, so I have to talk a little bit about that, because that's related to Calvert County too. We said the British came in at Benedict, just across the river from Calvert County. Benedict is where they trained the colored troops, the United States colored troops. There were over 6,000 United States colored troops trained there at Benedict. And what they did was they separated them by where they came from. The idea being that if you had somebody around you that you had something in common with, you'd be less likely to run away and desert. So the Prince George's County soldiers were put in a regiment. The Calvert County soldiers in a regiment, and the Eastern Shore soldiers in a regiment that were trained there. They were great fighters, but there were more people that died at Camp Stanton, and that's who they named it after, the Secretary of War, Stanton. More people died at Camp Stanton than died in the war, because you take a look at, they put their, they had their drinking water down here, the river, and they had their latrines, the bathrooms up here at the top of the hill. So they died from yellow fever, smallpox, any type of airborne disease you can think of. They died from it at Camp Stanton before they had an opportunity to get to it. They did fight well once they got into it. Now the Calvert County Regiment was a special regiment because they, as they were training there, they did as they did in the fields when they were slaves. They started making up songs, and they liked the uniform, although they had to buy their own uniform. The white soldiers, Union soldiers, were given their uniforms. The black soldiers had to buy theirs. That was one of the things that Frederick Douglass argued with Abraham Lincoln about when he came to the White House, and felt that they weren't being treated fairly. But they liked the uniform, so they wrote a song called "They Look Like Men of War." The commanding officer at Camp Stanton later became the president of Hampton University. So a white officer became the president, the general, and president of Hampton University. He wrote down that song and he put it in the Hampton archives, but he considered that to be the first black battle hymn. And so that's what they sang as they were going into war. They look like men of war. You would think they would have made a ton of money off of that, but no, again, no one knew anything about copyrights at that time, and so no one, copyrighted the information, except about 20 years later, the Mormons did. So that very same song was copyrighted by the Mormons, essentially word for word. They look like men of war, but the money's going into the Mormon church now. But, so, as these were all infantrymen, so when it was time for them to leave, and most of them started around 1864, they were marched from Benedict all the way to Washington, D.C. to walk by the White House so that Abraham Lincoln could see them. And then from there, they marched all the way down to their first battle site in Florida, walking. And we was talking about how long it took to get from Baltimore riding a bike here. You'd have to walk all the way down to Florida. And they were on their way back, and they were just outside of Appomattox when the war ended. And white soldiers, again, threw their rifles down, war's over, we're going home. Black soldiers threw their rifles down. They were told, pick them back up. They had signed, when they came to Camp Stanton, a 3-year contract. The white soldiers were drafted for the duration of the war. So when the war ended, they were free. The black soldiers signed a 3-year contract, and they were held to that contract. So they were taken to Baltimore, put on a ship, and sent down to Texas to guard the Texas-Mexican border. They were some of the soldiers that told those other blacks in Galveston, hey, you guys are free, that the war's over and this is going on. So we had that connection with Calvert County and the soldiers at Galveston. So that's the part with the Juneteenth. So before you all fall asleep, I have to ask, are there any questions? Because I promised no more than like 30 minutes or so. Yes?
Did the battle song that the Mormons took and patented, did that ever become another song with words? I mean, they have a famous choir. Have we ever heard it?
I have the lyrics in my book, and it is, they're still using it pretty much word for word. As far as how famous it is, I don't know. Because again, it was the late 1800s when they got the copyright for it. We're 5 minutes to 2 now, so I know I'm over, I guess.
So, on the farms in Maryland and Kentucky and border states, where the people were bred, children were bred for slavery,
Yes.
you're saying that a mother who would have 14 children would watch all of them have to be dragged away and sold? I mean, that was time after child after child after child.
Right. She didn't have any choice. And the owners didn't care if it was their own child, so they would father some of their children, those children themselves. because early on, the law here was the same as it was in Europe, that it was the paternity of the father that mattered as to which you would inherit. And here in the United States, when they started bringing in enslaved people, they changed that law here to say that it's the paternity of the mother that matters. So it doesn't matter if you have a white father, if you have an enslaved mother, you're born a slave. And it was actually Thomas Jefferson. You know, he did a lot of good things, a lot of bad things. Thomas Jefferson is the one that ended the African slave trade, in part because he had an idea that Virginia might need that money of sending slaves farther south. So Virginia and Maryland to enable to help those Virginia planters. Yes, sir.
You didn't explain the lottery.
Oh, that's because pretty much, again, I'm descended from a white person. Most everybody else is. Pretty much all of Calvert County for a long time was 50% white, 50% black. And just in the recent years, maybe the last 10 or 15 years, it's become majority white because it's so expensive to live there now. So unless you already have property there.
It's a suburb of Washington.
Yes, always that, but again, no one was interested in coming to Calvert until, and this is one of the other unique things about Calvert County, is that we had Louis Goldstein born there. Okay, so a lot of things that go on there because Louis Goldstein had the nuclear power plants come there, which brought tons of money, so they didn't have to raise property taxes ever. But they could put all that money into the school system. So we had a lot of wealthy people start moving to Calvert County because the school system was so much better in other places because of the money they had. And that then forced a lot of the poorer middle class people to move out of Calvert County. So Calvert County now, of course, during the time of enslavement, was 70% black. At the time that I was in school, in 1960, it was exactly 50-50. 12,600 people, the entire population of Calvert County, 12,600 people, 50-50, half black, half white. I graduated high school in 1975. It was 60-40, only 40% black, 60% white. Now it's only 14% blacks in our Calvert County. It shrunk down to that much. And again, most of those people are the ones that had property that they inherited from their family were able to stay there and not move there.
Was it in the marriage and
Didn't have to marry. They still don't
no,
marry,
no,
just
not
have kids.
during that time, but now? Is it because there's been more white?
Well, now it's a lot of mixes. There are a lot of mixed Asians and whites and
Oh, yeah,
everything.
sure,
Yeah, so it's a lot of mixing of everything.
Other marriages.
It's like 10 different choices you get in the school chart when they ask you what race you are. Yes.
Did you say your last name is Kent because your great-grandmother didn't want your real name King, or the real paternity of King to be known?
Right, she felt that was going to be too much of an insult to the slave owner's wife if she named her kids King, and some of them look just like her. My father still has his family's bloodlines on the white side, so I brought him to a doctor up here in, again, as I said, they live a long time, see a doctor up here in a hospital here in Baltimore when he was 90 years old. And the doctor kept walking in and out of the room, walking in and out of the room, looking at him, walking out. And then finally he says, well, this chart I have says I'm supposed to see a 90-year-old black man, and all I see is a 60-year-old white man.
That's amazing.
Yes.
So if you did your DNA, I guess you would have hits all the way back to Africa or wherever. But how about through the white families? Do you see?
They were some of the original colonists from England, the King family were.
Really?
Yes. That's why they had so much land. They had the grants from England. And it was funny, I did a program, the same lecture at Asbury, which is one of the wealthier senior housing facilities in the southern part of Calvert, Solomons. And I did my family's history and everything. And then I was contacted by one of the residents there, and she said, I checked my family history, and it just turns out that James King you talked about, that's your great-great-grandfather, he was my grandfather's brother. So it turns out we were cousins. So,
Wow. that's a whole nother direction then, isn't it? It's fascinating.
All right, Michael, thank you very much. Being a parsimonious volunteer organization, this is the reward we can offer you. And I would like to remind everybody that we are a volunteer organization, a nonprofit foundation, so all your memberships and any donations you care to make help us continue with these programs and others and continue working on improving the house and the site and sharing the history of the Todd family and the whole operation down here on the North Quinn Peninsula. So, can you stick around a little while in case people want to talk? Sure. Okay, well good. Thanks again.